Thank you all for coming out. Thank you. My name is Stuart Patterson, for those of you who don't know me, and I am on the faculty at Shimer College.
And for those of you that don't know me, I am Lisa Montgomery, the Director for the Student Center for Diversity and Inclusion at IIT, and we would like to welcome you.
And I want to get started right away by introducing our convener for the conversation that we're all going to have, first between Dr. Adams and Professor Black and Richard Steele. And for those of you who don't know Richard Steele by name, I guess that you're going to recognize his voice as soon as you hear it. Mr. Steele is an award-winning host and correspondent for WBZ Public Media. And he is a vice president board member of the local American Federation of Television and Radio Artists and a board member of the Chicago Association of Black Journalists.
Well, first of all, welcome. It's so good to be here this evening, and the two people here with me, they're so incredible. I don't have to say too much. I'm going to give them some lead lines and roll from there, but I want to tell you a little bit about both of them because it's really important that you know who these folks are. So check this out. All right, so Dr. Carol Adams, you'll notice throughout the evening I'll just call her Doc because that's what we call her. We just say, Doc, what's up? Dr. Carol Adams, President and CEO of the DeSalvo Museum of African American History. Consummate fundraiser, Dr. Adams has raised over $400 million for a diverse and varied group of institutions of higher learning, governmental agencies, not-for-profits. He was formerly the chairman of the African American Studies Department at Loyola, director of the Center for Inner City Studies at Northeastern Illinois University, and secretary of the Illinois Department of Human Services, where she managed a staff of 14,000 with a budget of over $5 billion. Educated at Fisk University. As a matter of fact, she was born in Louisville, studied music at Lincoln University for about a year, then went to Fisk, and at a later point, University of Chicago. A varied history, but I want to get that HBCU information in, historically black colleges and universities. Very, very important. She also attended the John F. Kennedy School of Government and Affairs at Harvard and Yale University. In addition to that, she has a Phi Beta Kappa key, you know? But she's real down to earth. And the other thing too I want to mention very quickly, and I was so glad you brought the book, because I was wondering, I read this and I was wondering, I said, well, because sometimes you get information online, you're not sure whether it's accurate or not, and I hadn't known this before, but it said that you studied under esteemed sociologist Horace Caton, of course, who wrote the book with St. Clair Drake, Black Metropolis, which is like kind of the standard, it's the recognized text of record up until a few years ago. It still is, but there are other books now, but the book still is an incredible work. Having said that, I just want you to welcome Dr. Carol Adams. My good friend Timuel Black, born in Birmingham, Alabama. His family became part of the first great migration of African Americans from the Deep South, settling in Chicago in 1919. That means Tim was born in 1918. That's right. And still looking great and doing what he does. Yeah. In 1955, after seeing Dr. King on television, Tim was motivated to abandon his doctoral studies at the University of Chicago to become an active participant in the civil rights movement. He went on to, and you should know this, Tim went on to serve as the Chicago chair for the historic 1963 March on Washington. I think there were two train loads, Tim? 2 train loads that left from Chicago to go to Washington. Oh, yeah. And Tim was in charge of that. So, I mean, a big activist. 2008, Tim got an honorary doctoral degree from his alma mater, Roosevelt University. And in January of 2012, the Timuel Black Archive was officially inaugurated and open to researchers. This massive archive of Tim's documents, letters, and memorabilia is housed at the Vivian G. Harsh Collection at the Carter G. Woodson Regional Library of Chicago. And he's got 2 incredible books, Bridges of Memory, Chicago's First Wave of Migration. And he is also working on a memoir, which he told me tonight is going to be through in a couple of months. So how about a hand for Dr. Timuel Black? And as was pointed out, we're going to leave the last 30 minutes of this conversation open to you so you can ask some questions. I'm just going to put some stuff out there, and I'll put this to both. Some questions individually and some topics, and anyone can speak up. This is a conversation between people I know. We're friends. It's okay, right? Dr. Adams, we'll go with you first. Well, I have to ask, what was your perception of race issues during those early years, and what did you observe about your parents and how they handled it? Did they have thoughts about moving north to escape? What was your experience like?
What a great question. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and it's an interesting Southern experience because there was segregation, but not violent segregation as there was in deeper parts of the South. It was sort of border, and things were a little different. In fact, after the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, when schools integrated, they just integrated. There wasn't anybody outside throwing eggs and fighting and cursing and all of that. The school was just integrated. However, I have been very much involved in the civil rights movement coming up because we did have barriers to certain things, particularly in the downtown area. And there was organizing going on when I was in high school where people from CORE were coming through towns training and getting people interested in being active in that movement.
But it was segregated facilities, though?
Yes. So it happened in, here we go. So it happened in a real interesting way. The NAACP was like the only civil rights organization at that time in Louisville, and we weren't very much engaged with it. By we, I mean young people. We're not very much engaged in it. They were involved in some things, but we didn't know much about it. So I had a guy in my class who became a part. They decided to organize a junior section of the NAACP. And he became the head of it, and he invited his classmates to come to a meeting one Saturday morning to hear about this particular thing. So that Saturday morning I got up and went to a meeting. And I was really surprised that the friend that invited me and my other classmates were not at the meeting. But I stayed. It was at a church. He gave us, it's at sort of like an intersection. And I went in this church where I saw other people going. To make a very long story short, it was an organizing meeting for CORE. And I stayed, and it was very interesting. And maybe about the middle, I realized that this was not the meeting that I was supposed to be going to, but it was so good, I didn't leave. And they were so skilled at organizing that they asked us a question. They asked us, what store downtown did we spend, where did we spend our money? Where we could not go to the restaurant, okay, or try on clothes, which was common in the South. You can go and shop, but you can try on clothes. I mean, after all, who wants to try them on after you? We had even the thing where your mom had to measure your foot on a piece of paper and take it to the store to shop for your shoes because you couldn't try the shoes on. And so he said, well, listen, you guys should not be spending your money where you can't do all of these things. And in fact, we're gonna go downtown right now and go to Coffins and try to go to the restaurant. That day, okay? So, I'm down, but because I see everybody start saying, well, I would, but I had something else to do, so everybody started backing out. And so who was left was a couple of adults and those of us who were younger.
You went?
And I went, and that was on after that. It was like a fever or something. I mean, once you get in this thing, it just takes over.
Let me ask this, did your parents talk about their experiences?
Well, I'm getting to my parents.
Okay.
Because I had to go home after that. Okay? Because I didn't call, we didn't have cell phones and anything. I just went there. And so I went home and my mom was like angry. She said I was going to make my dad lose his job. And this was gonna be bad, and I should never have done that. And I shouldn't get involved with those communists. I said, with some white people there, and you know, they said they were communists if they were involved with some black people and civil rights people. She said, shouldn't get involved in those communists, your dad's gonna lose his job, you're gonna have your name in the paper, et cetera, et cetera. So my father came home, I was scared to death. My mom tells him what his daughter did, because I was his daughter that day.
Right.
And he said, I'm really proud of you.
Wow.
Okay? I am really happy to hear what you did, and I'm not worried about my job. That's why I have business. So I'm all right. My father went to Tuskegee Institute
Okay.
during the time of George Washington Carver. And he was what they used to call in my town a race man. And so he had absolutely no problems with what I did, and I subsequently became the president of CORE in Louisville. The whole thing added up as should.
Started right off kicking booty, right? Timuel Black. Your parents came from Birmingham, Alabama. In 1919, you were still a baby. So you grew up in Chicago, and did you hear your parents, as you got to be older, 10, 11, 12 years old, growing up, did you hear them talk about Alabama and what they went through in the South? How did you get knowledge about what, I mean, there was racism in Chicago, obviously, but there were different brand of racism in the South. It was very violent. A lot of the times, violent here in Chicago some of the times, and as a matter of fact, the year that your parents came to Chicago, that was the 1919 was that major race riot here in Chicago. There were several race riots across the country, but this was one of the biggest ones in that particular year.
Yeah, well, to make a long story short, my story goes this way, and you believe it or not. When I was 8 months old, born in Birmingham, Alabama, I looked around, saw what was going on there, and I said to my mama, look, I'm leaving here. Mama said to Daddy, Dixie, this boy getting ready to leave here, and he doesn't even know how to change his diaper. So, putting it into the reality, my family came to Chicago. My brother, my sister, and my father, mother, and myself. When I was 8 months old, they came up on the 12th, at least the train that ran from Louisiana up to Chicago at 12th Street Station. They got off and they were met by friends and relatives who were already here. Let's take the story back a little bit. The first settler on the banks of what we now call the Chicago River was a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Pointe de Sable, later translated to Du Sable, who was a fur trader. He was Haitian. His father was French, his mother was Haitian. He was educated in France. He came to this area as a moneymaker, a businessman, married a Native American woman, and they had children and moved away. So there were always people of color, African Americans, in Chicago. But the first great migration came during World War I, 1915, and ended about 1945 or 6 after World War II. The first great migrants fled the South. They were people who had urban experience, but the horrors of Jim Crow and lynchings and all of that Ku Klux Klan, many left because they had lived in urban areas and they had somewhat urban sophistication in Birmingham, in Louisville, in Nashville, and on we could go. So they were first encouraged to come north, by the man who founded the Chicago Defender, and he sent papers south, Robert Allen. He sent papers south by the Pullman porters, and they were usually read by many people, and the theme was, "Come north, young man." And it beautified it so much that people couldn't believe that life would be that much better anywhere, since their life had been so horrible, horrendous in the South. And so, also, at this time, many of the workers who were immigrants from the South, from Europe, had come to America, and they had learned the skills of union organizing in Europe, as Europe industrialized and urbanized. Those merchants wanting to maximize profits sent agents south, encouraging these somewhat urban skills. My father worked in the steel mill in the South. The house where I was born, believe it or not, is still there, which my younger relatives have moved back and they're there. Now, with those two encouragements, and the urging of many of the female parents to get their husbands out of that terror, they were glad to have an opportunity to leave and be able to make even a better living. So they came north.
Let me ask you a question. Hold on for a minute. One of the things that's in your book that I want you to talk about for a second, in your book, Bridges of Memory, Chicago's First Wave of Great Migration, you mentioned survival strategies that is coming to the big city. Because when people came, some people came from the South, and this was like, I mean, first of all, winter was cold, like we're not talking about winter right now. But it was a whole different environment. Survival was different. People were, let me flash back on something. This is from another book, and I thought this was pretty interesting. This is from not from a book, but this is something that Ralph Ellison wrote. He was, of course, the author of The Invisible Man. But he wrote these words in 1939. This was about, and I'm talking about strategies again, but this is about New York. He said, I asked an old man hanging out at Eddie's Bar on St. Nicholas Avenue near 147th Street, do you like living in New York City? And the man said, I'm in New York, but New York ain't in me. He was from Jacksonville, Florida. And he had been in New York 25 years. But it was a whole, he was talking about pimps and the numbers game, cheating black people out of their money and shooting, cutting, and stuff like that. So he was saying, in essence, that not that there wasn't crime ever where he came from, but this was a whole different kind of living in the city. So, as he said, I'm in New York, but New York ain't in me. So talk about that whole issue of survival strategies when you get to the big city.
Well, for my family, my experience, there was the differences, of course, that my mother and father felt and told my brother, sister and I, was that they felt more safe and comfortable on the south side of Chicago than they had ever felt in Birmingham, Alabama, or in Florence, Alabama, where my mother was born, or in Jacksonville. They felt a sense of security that they had never felt. But at the same time, what they expected, besides the cold weather in the north, was not there. The segregation was very clear. My father worked in the steel mill in South Side and lived in the stockyards. He could work there, but he couldn't shop. He'd better get on the streetcar and get home if it was late in the evening. That was dangerous. When they came to Chicago, the race ride was just over, but they were not afraid that there might be another race ride. Now, the race ride itself was very interesting because the rioters that started the riot, they were not from the neighborhood where the riot took place at 31st and 30th and 29th Street Beach. They were from Bridgeport, but they were first generation immigrants, and yet they had been told, the story had been said, don't hang out with those Negroes. It was a different kind of word that they used. And so this little boy swimming in Lake Michigan happened to swim across the wrong side, and he was beaten to death. The riot started. Now, at that time, the members of the 8th Regiment Army, which was built for blacks in Brownsville, they were returning from World War I, and they had learned to be in combat. And when they heard that some of their neighbors were being attacked, they broke into the armory, pulled out the guns, and began to fight back. According to a little bit of history, that was the first time that kind of retaliation, the riot was soon over. Because, the fighting was going on.
Hold your point there. I want to bring Dr. Adams back to this conversation. One of the things that we hear a lot about in Chicago, because there's so many people from Mississippi, is that, people go back home. I know when I was growing up, and I was right here, I was at 32nd Calumet, I went to Douglas Grammar School, and I know that every summer, everybody went to Mississippi. I mean, that's when you went to see you went to stay with your grandparents for the summer. I was not from, my grandparents were in Brooklyn. And so, when people came back from summer vacation, my story was always different. They said, well, what's wrong with him, you know what I mean? But I want to talk about the whole issue of going back, going back.
There were two great migrations.
Three.
I'm talking about numbers, but three maybe, but the first one came from that period, 1915, the beginning of World War I, ending right after. Most of those people, most, not all, came from the urban South, even if it was Mississippi, Natchez, and Vicksburg and other places. And in this ghetto that was now bounded by something called restrictive covenants, that agreement between landowners and landowners that they would not rent or sell to blacks under any condition regardless. And so in that ghetto developed parallel institutions, parallel economic, parallel political, parallel cultural. In this neighborhood, blues and jazz evolved. Louis Armstrong and all those talented people began to come in this neighborhood. Now, as far as I know, and my knowledge and experience limited, as some of you may find out, the people that I know, and the people around our neighborhood, they never went back south unless somebody died. Our relatives would come here to see us. And just to give a kind of a funny tinge to it, my cousins and all that came to Chicago almost every summer and so forth. When I went back to Birmingham to be with Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963, I called my cousins and I said, I'm in town. And without hesitation, they said, don't come by here. That meant they would be in serious trouble if they were identified with this rapper. So that's my experience of it. Now the second great migration.
Hold your point. No more than that. I got to hear from Dr. Adams on that going back home thing, right?
Well, the reason why, I didn't have any going back home because I was in Kentucky. So that was home. But the reason why I made the comment that there was a third migration, it wasn't a recognized one. It's always considered two great waves. But when I look at my own family history, they migrated at the end of slavery. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
7 brothers. My family originated in Louisiana. And 7 brothers left there and went to Kentucky, because you could homestead land. And that was very important. So there's a period of time when people moved to places where they could get land, where they could start off, where they could have a fresh start, so to speak. It was a farm, but they all came there and they stayed there. My father did not believe in leaving. He considered the strength in the family and the extended family. And so the thought of coming to Chicago, no, he didn't believe in it. You know, he believed in staying there, working in your neighborhood, working in your community, making it work. In fact, because he was there's another previous important point about this. My father and my uncle decided they wanted to go to college. At the time that they graduated from high school, there was no black college in the state of Kentucky, which meant they tried to go to the University of Kentucky. They didn't have to understand how long ago this was because my father was born in 1905, all right? The state of Kentucky said, listen, you're absolutely not going here, but we will pay you boys way to go to one of the black schools. And so they paid their way to go to Tuskegee. And this is not an unusual story. You will find this happen in a lot of places where this happened.
Sure.
Okay? So, subsequent to that, my father had girls, his brother had sons. They went to Tuskegee. They came back. They went to the service because they couldn't find any work. So they joined the Air Force. And then they joined again. And then they came back and they still could only work at the post office. And it was then that the migration started from my family. Because they said, we're not staying here. There's only so many black teachers that can teach at this school. And once they start teaching, they stay until they die. And I'm not working at the post office. I got an education and all this time in the Air Force. So one went to Seattle to work for Boeing, and another went to out to Boston, Massachusetts to work for some other military-related thing. And that set the example for us. It said to us, if you want to do something, you have got to leave. And so it was always in my mind that when I graduated from college, I gave not one moment's thought to staying in Louisville, although I know my father would have really loved it. So all of us went somewhere else. And I think it's a rather devastating thing when I look at it in retrospect. Because that strength that all of them had and all of those family members had, we lost. Because we scattered all over the United States. Somebody went to Detroit, somebody went to Chicago, somebody went here, somebody went there, and we lost something in the process.
Well, not only that, a lot has been said about losing the land. Because there were landowners. I mean, everybody who was African American was not necessarily just a sharecropper. Some people did own the land. And so the idea is that, I mean, the thought has been that when people moved and nobody stayed or they sold off the land, this was property that at a later point, like the people who did hold on to the land, some of these people have moved back to that land. People who, I'll give you a good example of somebody I met, the actor Morgan Freeman. I was involved with a thing one New Year's Eve about 5 years ago in Mississippi, a broadcast we did, Toast of the Nation. And Morgan Freeman owns a lot of land in Mississippi. He moved back to Mississippi. And he and a white attorney are business partners. And he owns a plane, he flies his own airplane, you know, and all that. But he lives in Mississippi.
He's a beneficiary of 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah, he's one of the people who came back. And he invested. He also invested in, he's got different investments around town. But that's where he lives. I mean, he doesn't live in Hollywood. He lives in Mississippi.
A lot of
But
people
just
move
like to
back.
clarify one point though, we talk about the great migrations. I'm not talking about necessarily, but in 1915, according to U.S. Census, in Chicago, there was something around 60,000 blacks. Now scattered all over at that time, not concentrated in the ghetto as it was then. But then by 1920, that number had doubled to about 120,000. And when I went to the Army, that number was 225,000. That's the first Great Migration. Now, in the second Great Migration, people, primarily, not all, from the rural agricultural South pushed off the land by the creation of new agricultural technology, making them unnecessary in terms of labor, having been deprived of the right to go to school and get education, couldn't read. I had not seen young blacks who couldn't read, write, and count until I was in the army. These 18 and 19-year-olds who had volunteered to get away from the South. They couldn't read, write, and count, but they could shoot, which was the most important thing in that army that had to be in. They were nice guys, and they learned to speak French and German very quickly. That they were not Dumcos by any means, but they fled then and brought their families from the South to the North, to Chicago and other places that were similar. Now, there was a clash there because of restrictive covenants keeping us boarded in, that there were double that 225,000 in that short period of time. That number doubled with folk who were different in Chinese school. And then the second Hansberry case, Carl Hansberry, Lorraine Hansberry's father, raising the son, he had taken a second case to the Supreme Court, Shelley versus Kramer, which said that restrictive covenants were unenforceable anywhere in the country. Guys returning from the service like me, having the GI Bill of Rights, getting married, we fled that old neighborhood and left our brothers and sisters isolated, which had not been the case in the first Great Migration. Now there's a very distinct difference, and what we're seeing now even is a class distinction. And that is so obvious to many people who have seen the evolution of this population in the urban areas in the North.
Listen, this is what I want to focus on now because we have our time getting a little short. I'm glad you brought that up because I want to focus on this part of the conversation on what kind of impact the fact that all these African Americans, we came here from different places and settled in Chicago. Chicago became really, a northern city with a very large African American population, and many people succeeded. At one point, Chicago had the largest number of black banks and car dealerships and lots of other things. So I want you to focus on for a minute, Carol, I want you to start with this about how the fact that African Americans were in such large numbers in Chicago, how that changed the landscape of Chicago, how we got to be this city that had Ebony and Jet and all the other people that became pioneers.
Well, it changed the landscape in a number of ways. It also just changed the landscape in terms of the geographic boundaries because there was still restrictions to where you can live, and so they kept confining us and building up and all of that. So that part of the landscape was impacted. But the other thing was, folks in the South had been in businesses. They were accustomed. Segregation had created a situation where you owned things and you had businesses, and they brought an enterprising spirit along with them. So there wasn't just the people who went to work in the factories, there were the people who said, well, I can establish a business. And if there is segregation in Chicago, and there was, we can have our own stores for all of these things.
And funeral home business and other places like that.
All kinds of businesses, okay? And so this enabled a flourishing black community, a black community where your dollars recirculated over and over again within that community. They gave rise to banks, if you looked at, I did a program some time ago about the West Side, because that was the first place where black people started owning homes in Chicago, was on the West Side before they moved south. And when you looked at the businesses, every conceivable thing you could want was in the community, and all those businesses were owned by black people. You know,
and those that were owned by whites, just to give a little bit of experience, had to hire me because we had a thing that was supported by Robert Abbott and the other two newspapers that whipped in the beat. If you don't spend your money where you can't work.
Exactly.
So I never worked outside of the black belt until I was ready to go to college. That didn't mean I made a lot of money, but I had jobs.
But there were jobs, and there were jobs that would start you young, and you could work your way up, and you saw yourself as an owner, and there were a lot of flourishing manufacturing concerns that came out of Chicago, and that existed not only from the early migration, but really all the way to when I came here as part of that second wave. I moved to Chicago in 1966, and I could have Joe Louis milk and get a Cadillac from Al Johnson and some hair products from George Johnson and a magazine from John Johnson. I mean, it was just going on like that.
The first,
But I think that, and certainly that was an incredibly significant part of Chicago. But I think business people don't. Maybe they do realize it when they've done the research. All of that also was a significant part of Chicago as a successful city, in terms of commerce overall, you know what I mean? It wasn't in total isolation in that the money did circulate more than one time in the black community, which was great, but also...
At least 6 times.
It also
turned around at least 6 times.
But it also made Chicago a more viable place overall.
Absolutely.
For the ordinary person. Now, the first black congressman after Reconstruction, Oscar DeFreeze, from Florence, Alabama, lived very close to where we are now. He was elected congressman in 1928, I think, 27 or 28, and continued to be the first congressional district and the first 10 black certified public accountants in the country came out of black Chicago because of the concentration and the sophistication that existed at that time, and that broke up a good deal when integration began to come into the picture.
One of the people that was one of the first black accountants, Doc, was a man by the name of Ted Jones, who, when I first came back here to do radio in 1970, Ted Jones was a minority part of the ownership of WGRT. And I met him then, and very successful guy. He invited us to his house one time because he was trying to keep us from asking for more money, when we were having a union negotiation. But we went to his house, and I was overwhelmed. He had a maid, and he was a big game hunter. So he took us to the den, and he had heads on the wall, of animals that he'd shot. I went, oh, this is way above my pay grade. But he was a very smart guy, very successful, and as Tim pointed out, these are people who worked hard, elevated themselves to positions that prior to that, not a lot of African Americans had. Chicago seemed to be ripe for that. Just a lot of things happened in this city during that period. Well, let me ask you this. Let me ask both of you this. How much of that has been transferred in terms of the thought of having some concept or idea of what people have been through and where we're going? I'm talking about the younger generation now. We sort of skipped over, we went to 2 generations very quickly. The first generation, the second generation, people your age and my age, and then there's another group now that, what does it look like at this point, do you think? I mean, the awareness...
When you say another group, you mean another group migrating?
No, not migrating,
Okay.
but just, like here in Chicago as African Americans, products, 3rd generation of the people who came from South. But now, what do they do with that? I mean, they, where do we stand at this point in terms of moving forward?
What do they do with what?
This heritage that they have,
Okay.
people who worked hard.
All right. Well, I think, again, we've got several generations of descendants beyond us. And we have to look at everything that happened during that period when we look at what the civil rights movement did and what it was about. And the fact that it really was, at its earlier iteration, an integration movement. And so there was something that constantly was saying to people of African American descent that if you really want to achieve, you can only achieve through integration. Okay, this was repeated over and over again. It was practiced in many ways, and then when people had an opportunity to move or to get themselves at another level, they would do that because they saw that as progress. Okay? Now, I can remember having many conversations in my home in Louisville with my father about this because he had a big problem with that. Because he became very successful and he stayed in the neighborhood that he had been in when they were very, very, very poor. Because he said that it was a mistake to leave your community. It was a mistake for anybody who achieved to leave because you were not there to be an example for other people. Because during the segregated period, you might be poor, but the doctor lived next door to you, or somebody else lived somewhere else. And so you were always able to see very close to you a way to be something else and a way to be somebody else. And you didn't have the class division that Tim just referenced a moment ago that has been very detrimental to the community, nor a mindset that told you that the white man's ice was colder, that the only way you could achieve was in this way, that it wasn't important for you to keep table stakes, so to speak, that, you know, and so it meant that, I mean, I saw this when I was teaching at Loyola, so I use that as an example. Very early in the 70s, I think I taught that first African American Studies class. It's just one class. The students fought hard to get it, okay? And they got them that one class, and everybody in the world wanted to get it. Maybe 10 or 15 years later, I go back as the head of the department, and I'm working registration, and everybody's walking by trying not to see me. All the black students are doing it. You know, afraid I'm gonna stop them and start talking about something black. Okay? They didn't want this. They didn't want to hear it. Their parents told them, don't get involved in that stuff.
Right.
Okay? Don't get involved in that blank. I won't say the word.
Right.
But don't do it. Go there, get your thing, do this, get ready to progress. And so they are preparing to work for somebody. They weren't preparing to own stuff and have people work for them. They were being programmed to prepare to work for someone else. Okay? And that makes a big difference in how you see success. And I started to win it. So I did a few things to make sure that the students started taking my class, and it gave me a chance to start interacting with them and hearing the things they were being told about their parents. Okay, and hearing, and I asked them, I can remember so distinctly one day asking my students what their majors were and what you wanted to be. And not a single one said they wanted to own the company, they all wanted a job. That's number one. And secondly, I said, what would happen if you finished school with this degree and no one hired you?
Nothing.
They just said, well, we'll just keep looking. You know, we'll just keep looking. So it took bringing that, saying, hey, wait, you got a degree.
That's an option, right?
You got a certain thing. If you're an accounting major, what if you started your own accounting firm? And so one guy said, well, I don't want to just be some business just in the black community, because who could be using me? They don't have any business for me as an accountant. Okay? And so somewhere we missed the mark here in terms of passing on the importance of having your own, the independence that it meant, the fact that you could do business with yourself and you could do business with each other, and that would just be as notable as you being an accountant at the so-and-so Fortune 500 company. Because that's all they saw. They saw that as the top, and it's creating a disconnect that continues to this
Good
moment.
examples of what Carol just said exist today. Chinatowns, great towns, they can go wherever they wish, but they control those communities economically, therefore politically, and inside the culture and the social relationships give confidence to the younger people to move on. Come back though, feed in, enrich, and expand those communities. What happened after World War II with the breakdown of restrictive covenants and the opportunities, people like me and my children moved out of the old hood and left the newcomers I described them a little bit. I'm not talking about those from the urban areas now. I'm talking about from the rural. See, a cotton picker could pick more cotton in a day than 100 human beings. Therefore, that 99 had no place to go, and they've been deprived of the opportunity to have quality education, as I and my generation had had. So they now are isolated. When my parents came, Dr. Dawson lived down the street. My mama could say, see that? He look like you can do that. His children, Junior and Junior and all, had to play with me. Or get beat up, so they played. So they played with me. Later, a generation later, I have his daughters in my class at Hyde Park High School. They go back home and brag to their dad. Oh, Daddy, you know we have Mr. Black and he's teaching Black history. And he could brag back at them. Oh, TD and I grew up together.
Tim,
Now
talk about one other thing though in relation to that, and that is public housing. Okay, and what that did when that was introduced in Chicago.
What's that?
Public housing.
Oh, public housing.
The role
The
they play
isolation. Oh, yeah, the
in economic isolation.
The isolation. If someone like me returning from the army with the, with the army privileges, I could move in, but if I got to make a certain amount of money, they'd put me out. And I was a social worker for a while, so I saw this as a fact. They built the Taylor homes specifically, those high rises. I'm not talking about Ida B. Wells, I'm not talking about, I'm talking about the high rises. That was built, and I know this because one of my friends was a chief engineer in that, an architect in that period who also went to IIT, by the way. And they built that as temporary housing, those high rises all over Chicago. And they were built to contain this relatively unsophisticated community. And if you happen to live, if a guy lost his job, which many of them lost their jobs, and the wife applied for welfare, she could not get welfare if there was a male in that house over 18 years old. So a lot of men stopped coming home except on the weekend. And the agency then began to send the agents around on the weekends to inspect the house. So the families began to deteriorate. Now the children are moving out at the breakdown against the 1954 decision about segregation in schools. Other people get the privilege, begin to move out of their own neighborhood and leave the isolation. And the teachers are not aware, or not, whatever it is, of the difficulties that are facing. And the gangs begin to come and others begin to flee the neighborhoods. And therefore the public schools begin to fall apart academically. And in many ways that still exists today. Now they're building what they call charter schools. Because the neighborhoods are now gentrifying. You see, the class distinction that Ms. Adams described is very obvious if you knew anything about the old black belt and you go through and you see those magnificent brownstone and gray stone houses that were never torn down. The population is becoming more and more mixed, which actually they've torn down the public housing now. All that high rise is now gone, vacant land.
And then you have to look to see what's coming in the place of it. Okay, so what happened with that massive displacement of people, which was transformed, right? Transformed you out of this valuable land somewhere on the outskirts, where it's harder even for you and harder for you to be able to maintain some semblance of family. In terms of the placement, they paid people to help to find housing for the folk who were displaced when the public housing was torn down. If you were a placement agent, you got paid more money if you placed a person outside, in Hammond, in so-and-so, in this and that, than you got paid to place them within the community, because those neighborhoods are not meant for you. I mean, where State Garden is, then I put private tennis clubs and stuff like that, okay? You see where it's happening in the Hilliard area. Forget about Cabrini, okay? All what happened there, because again, that land was valuable. They said this is way too valuable for poor people. So whatever your connectivity was, and it was as though there was no real family structure in these developments, and there was, okay? And a lot of successful people managed to come out of them. But all of that has been destroyed once again.
We're going to take questions in a minute. So one of the things that has been interesting about the gentrification is that, unlike Harlem, where the gentrification includes lots of different people of different ethnicities moving into the neighborhood, and what they've done, they've been able to encourage different kinds of investment. That hasn't happened in Chicago. The gentrification here, say in Bronzeville, is largely a black gentrification. And there's this mindset, I guess, with some of the business community, where even though the people that are moving back are some are African Americans and middle class and upper class in some of the properties that are there, it doesn't have the same ring to it, you know, in terms of...
A perfect example of that is Dominic's closing,
Yeah.
and who gets a new store, okay? And so then you see in certain communities, Mariano's and Jewel's happy to do the store. Well, I happen to live in the South Shore community, where there was a Dominic's,
We go to
a
the
rather
same store.
thriving one, right? And when you look at the community had a broad range
Very
of
broad.
economics, okay? Some of the wealthiest black people in Chicago live in that community, but you can't get a supermarket. You now live in a food desert. It doesn't make any difference if you're a college professor, a business owner, a leading civil rights leader, an entertainer, all those people that live in the Highlands, on the lake, in the O'Keefe area, in the other area, the store, 7 major supermarkets have said, oh, we'll take a pass.
Yeah, which is, we're all trying to, because I live in the same, we live close to...
I know, I live near you.
It's amazing.
You know, and we can afford to shop.
But they won't come into the neighborhood. The store's there, it's in a strip mall. There's lots of other business, a Walgreens right there and all of that, but it's not happening for some reason.
One of the things I'd like to insert here, Richard, is that many of the housing, particularly in the Grand Boulevard and the Washington Park area, the people moved out. My generation of my parents, they moved out, but they never sold that property.
Right.
So their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren are moving back into that property which was used as rooming housing temporarily. Now those brownstones and gray stones and beautiful 6 flats are being restored, renovated, and modernized in that general area. And so they never sold it in the first place, so it's their property, they just moved back and brought it up to the modern period.
Some didn't sell. Some, I mean, people who are visionaries. One of our great community leaders in the black community, Lou Palmer, used to say, do not sell. His house was right at, what was that? 37, yeah. Big, huge building. And he would tell people, years ago, this is way before the gentrification, he would say, at some point, this is going to be very, so don't sell the property. Keep the property in the family. But a lot of people, I guess, looked at maybe this is the last opportunity to, you know, to get some money out of this, and people sold when they should have held on to it.
Thank you.
Let me close with this. From the publishers, this was some comments made about Elizabeth Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. The Great Migration, which comes to life in the pages of this book, lasted from 1915 to 1970, involved 6 million people and was one of the largest internal migrations in U.S. history. It changed the country, north and south. It brought us jazz, Motown, rhythm and blues, hip-hop. It brought us John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Jimi Hendrix, Toni Morrison, August Wilson, Romeo Bearden, Malcolm X, Jesse Owens, Bill Russell, Denzel Washington, Michelle Obama. All children or grandchildren of the Great Migration. It changed the cultural and political landscape of America. Thank you all so much.
Richard, Timuel Black,